Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Society, for inviting me to give the Rhind lectures for 2011. It's an almost unparalleled and genuinely enviable opportunity for an academic, an opportunity to draw upon in-depth research over a long period, large bodies of data, and to try and bring these interconnected pieces of research into some sort of coherent and satisfactory synthesis. So I consider myself extremely fortunate and deeply honoured that it has come my way. And I realise there must have been supporters from within. I can guess who you are, so we'll do the reckoning later, whichever way it goes. And I should also, given bigger events today, be grateful for such a fine audience. Perhaps you've come for a little light relief. I should say I'm sorry about the clash, but I can assure you that I've set my date before a certain couple set theirs. Taking on the Rhinds cannot be done lightly. It's a very costly business. I don't mean financially, of course, but I have accrued enormous debts to many friends and colleagues, archaeologists and museum curators alike. They're too numerous to list, even in a slide, but a number of individuals and institutions will get acknowledged in slide captions or orally as we proceed, as apposite. In addition, let me make special mention, though, of the national museums throughout Britain and Ireland, where I've always received unstinting welcomes and have gained enormous amount, particularly from the national museums. And I'll mention again those two projects that I've been lucky enough to be involved in recent years, the Levy-Hume-backed Ritual and Early Bronze Age Grave Groups project and the Beaker Isotopes project. And thanks to the leaders of those projects, their names have already been mentioned, thanks to them for involving me and for allowing me to, willingly granting me permission to selectively use some of the data generated. And last but not least, thanks to my wife Sheridan, who's had to live with the Rhinds for quite a long time, and more particularly has had a big role in refining final presentations. She has a very sharp eye for issues of clarity and incongruity and such like, so I hope that it's a much smoother presentation as a result. I'm sure it will be. It's hard for us to appreciate what Rhind and his contemporaries would have made of our present understanding of the distant past. The study of prehistory was certainly in its infancy. Only the scantiest of frameworks had yet been established. What would he have anticipated in this series that he inaugurated? In this sense, there is as much a gulf between Rhind and us as between the Bronze Age and us. But of course, there is a common thread, the quest for knowledge of the past, irrespective of the platform we have available to us. And there is always, too, another powerful link between the inquiry of his time and that of ours, the tangible and durable artefacts and monuments of the past. And although his research focus was very different from mine, I have found one point of overlap. In Lecture 3, I shall focus on battle axes in context, and it is thanks to Rhind himself that we know something of one of the most northerly finds of a battle axe from a funerary monument, albeit in this case a Neolithic monument, that of Breckigo in Caithness. It feels good to have established a material link. In this lecture series, I'm going to take you through the amazingly rich world of early Bronze Age funerary practice in this part of Europe, a field that is both diverse in its character and attractive in its artefact accompaniments. In many ways, it is, I hope, an easy subject to engage you with. Ancient burials are innately fascinating for us. They make us reflect on our own mortality. Mute though those individuals are, we empathise with what they have gone through, what difficulties they have confronted in life, what expectations they had of death. And of course, for this period, there is the bonus of having frequent artefacts alongside the human remains, some functional, some aesthetic or impressive, others more enigmatic. These too we can relate to. They might be our trappings, things we prize for one reason or another, things we use on a regular basis, things that point to our role in the world, or things that identify us as unique personalities. And perhaps also at a deeper level, a deeper, less personal level, there is another connection. Seeing embraced together in a unified context, the body and its corporeal extensions, the artefacts, a reminder of the intertwined destiny of humans and material culture, a reminder of the very essentialness of artefacts to the state of being human. Such a range of emotions can be evoked immediately and subliminally as we cast our eyes over the ancient burial, its grave furniture and material goods. It is easy to sense their hopes and fears about the afterlife, even though we know that their particular beliefs will have differed fundamentally from our own. It is easy also to make assumptions about the individuality of this person, about how the accompanying objects might define her or him within their society. Questions of identity, status, role, and personality clamour for attention, and indeed it is the case that such questions have been major preoccupations in the study of early Metal Age burials for a long time. But as with the study of all societies that held different values from ours, and especially those for which no thoughts could be written down in words, the more we explore, the more we realise it may not be so straightforward. Many assumptions about the early Metal Age burial phenomenon have been challenged or questioned over recent decades. I'll be introducing these altered perspectives tonight. In this opening lecture, then, I'm going to firstly set out the scope of my subject for the series, secondly summarise the key constituents of the funerary phenomenon of the early Metal Age, thirdly present an outline history of this phenomenon, including the much debated matter of its inception, and fourthly, review some of the main interpretations of burial in this period. The funerary phenomenon, which forms my core subject this weekend, is represented by a considerable number of finds. Literally thousands of burial contexts have been excavated and reported in the archaeological literature over the past 2 centuries. At times, I wonder the country didn't look a bit like this. Thanks to the Economist. Obviously, they were using this concept in a slightly different context. The sheer scale of the data set immediately presents a methodological headache, and these uncounted thousands are themselves undoubtedly only a fraction of the total buried over the course of the early Metal Age. My ambitious objective is to try to understand better the purpose of this burial tradition and the factors which caused its varied material expressions. This is not made easy by the fact that there is a great variety in the types of artefacts used and diversity in the burial contexts. In fact, archaeologists have been struggling with this problem since the beginning of responsible excavation and reporting. The great pioneers of barrow digging, William Cunnington and Sir Richard Colt-Hoare, expressed frustration at not finding clearer patterns among the many burial associations they uncovered in Wiltshire in the early years of the 19th century. Since then, of course, we have made great progress, discovering that some object types tend to go together or tend to be associated with one sex or the other, that men may be buried differently from women at certain times, that certain burial rites prefer certain locations in the monuments that generally mark the burial site. Unfortunately, too, thanks to much more precise and refined radiocarbon dating of the past 20 years, we now understand a great deal more about the relative chronologies of different types, and we have a fairly reliable temporal structure with a total span of almost a millennium. The handsheet that I've provided you with tonight is there as an aid memoir. It of course cannot be comprehensive. It's nevertheless fairly complicated. I hope it will help you to interrelate the chronologies of my main case studies from lecture to lecture. We will be building this up, therefore, gradually, and you can assimilate it bit by bit as we go. As you can see, my case studies are spread throughout the early Metal Age funerary phenomenon, and it is also important to situate this phenomenon within the broader trajectory of funerary practice, and later in this lecture I'll be saying a little bit about what went before in the Neolithic and what followed in the Middle Bronze Age. Saying that we have a better grasp of chronologies, though, does not mean that we automatically have better prospects for understanding the meaning of association patterns and the reasons behind changes or differences. There is much variation that still defies easy explanation, short of invoking widespread caprice or unfathomable rationales. But I will strive to improve our understanding of the structure and purpose of the early Metal Age funerary phenomena. To do so, I'm going to target a range of key artefact associations, complete with their burial contexts. The focus on artefact-containing graves should not be read as a statement to the effect that those lacking objects are insignificant and not worthy of detailed study. The recently published Raunds area project, based on large-scale excavations of one ceremonial complex in the Northamptonshire Valley, wonderfully illustrates the tremendous value of an all-inclusive approach at the regional and site-specific levels of analysis. Just a few of the graves here illustrated from that project. They're quite typical, really, of the burial record generally in this country. There's one burial with just a pot. There are three others with nothing at all recognisable. In contrast, my case studies tend to focus, if not necessarily on so-called rich grave groups, nevertheless on those with the more distinctive artefacts. This may seem like cherry-picking, but actually it's a pragmatic starting point, since in broad-scale analysis so many more dimensions of interaction and interpretation come into play when artefacts are present rather than when they are absent or intangible. Moreover, I am reasserting the case that with caveats we can link certain distinctive artefacts to categories of burial, or what I'm going to call burial modes. Whatever specific interpretation we put on accompanying artefacts, we need to remember that they are not objects in isolation. As Paul Traherne and others have spelled out, grave goods are merely components of a more fundamental artefact, the dead body. In these funerary contexts, the body was the focal artefact, but the material objects served critically to index it, to explain contemporary society's understanding of this particular individual or this particular act of interment. My next task is to review the main constituents of this funerary phenomenon, those in addition to the human body and the accompanying artefacts. Central to any consideration of the phenomenon are the sites on which burials took place. They are familiar to us as the barrows, cairns and ring cairns that still pepper parts of our modern landscape. Sites that had lasting tangibility and came to have a critical influence on the social geography of this, the early Metal Age, and succeeding eras. Many variations have been noted in their detailed morphology and the materials of construction, and many have been shown to be the end products of multi-stage and varied histories of construction. While most burials occur in or immediately around such monuments, we should not forget that a minority, probably a small minority, were placed elsewhere, sometimes in earlier monuments such as Neolithic barrows as at Thickthorn Down, or in henge monuments as at Cairnpapel Hill. Other burials seem to lie in glorious isolation or within slighter enclosures that left more fleeting marks on the land. It has been understood for a longish while that these sites, barrows and cairns, we call funerary, were actually the foci of other rituals that were not directly connected to interment. I shall in a moment run through a range of evidence for non-burial ritual, but it can be ambiguous or exiguous, and attempts to reconstruct the rituals and performances are necessarily rather speculative. We should keep in mind the possibility that this archaeologically more elusive component may actually have been responsible for more activity on funerary sites than either burial per se or episodes of construction. Sir Cyril Fox was one of the first to talk explicitly of the use of mound surfaces in his classic work Life and Death in the Bronze Age, and clear evidence can be seen, for example, at Pond Barrow in Dorset, where there was a sequence of 3 burning episodes high in a mound that was clearly enlarged progressively over time. Clandon, in fact, may have had a special role in the region. It is noteworthy that with a largely cleared landscape, it would have been visible from many surrounding barrow groups. And a fire burning on top would have made it even more widely visible. This touches upon the potential importance of indivisibility among these burial monuments, a theme which has become important in many recent barrow studies. Pond Barrow gives us good mileage, for it also raises another aspect of non-burial activity. It is most famous for its group of fine objects, long assumed to be from a burial. These too are fairly high in the mound and were associated with a small cairn of flint nodules. But there was actually no evidence for a skeleton or burnt bones, and this allows comparisons with other, clearer-cut examples of the deposition of valuables without bodies. A fine example was excavated at Lockington in 1994. A hoard of 2 gold armlets, a copper dagger, and portions of 2 beaker pots deposited on the northern periphery of a burial mound, probably at an early stage of its history, when the site was defined by a palisade enclosure and long before the mound itself was erected. Deposits not explicitly tied to interment are by no means confined to apparent valuables. There are, for instance, the many cases of cut-marked slabs incorporated into the bodies of mounds. This is far too frequent an occurrence to be dismissed as accident, as Richard Bradley and others have noted. And we have anyway the instances of deliberate reuse of carved rocks for constructing kists to illustrate the symbolic significance these motifs continued to have. Meanwhile, the Raunds project identified deposits of other materials. One pit had sherds and a couple of flints. Another contained charred plant remains and unidentified bone fragments. There are also examples of pottery vessels having been placed without any human accompaniment. The Lake group of barrows provides a nice example. G39, excavated by Grimes, yielded a biconical urn from the butt end of the enclosing penannular ditch. It can be seen that this barrow respects a set of 5 burials in the southeastern edge of G38, the one that it was appended to. One obvious explanation of unaccompanied pots would be the giving of food offerings to the ancestors. One type of material that occurs in mounds without burials more than a dozen times is jet. Single pieces might, of course, be dismissed as accidental losses, but a number are multiple objects, as small hoards, as for example at Helperthorpe. The implication of the various acts we can document at funerary sites, and probably others we cannot discern, is that the site with its buried dead of earlier generations held a special importance that went beyond a cemetery in the modern meaning. The presence of the ancestral dead gave these sites potency for other ritual affairs. If this deduction is correct, they may have been sanctified zones that gave privileged access to the other world. So, having summarised the nature of the sites where burial took place and the various other evidence for activity on those sites, let's return to look at the burials themselves in more detail. I've set out here in the central box a summary of the main tangible dimensions that may be observed for any individual burial and its mortuary passage. First, we have the individual in the deposit, a person who had, or persons who had a gender, an age, specific relatives and a position in the community. The second tangible dimension is the preparatory funerary treatment. For example, preparation of the corpse, such as dressing, binding or burning it, or preparing the site, such as enclosing it. And thirdly, there are aspects of transporting and placing the remains. For example, whether placed in a receptacle, such as a coffin, on a bier, or in a pot. Then there's the orientation of the burial, and whether a grave or a pit is dug. Another form of receptacle, if you like. And the fourth dimension is, of course, the grave goods. We need to keep in mind that some objects present in the context could be accidental conclusions, and that there may have been others that are archaeologically invisible. Now, these three last aspects can be collectively described as the burial rite, which would also embrace the archaeologically invisible performative rites that accompanied interment. The term that I will use from time to time in these lectures, burial mode, relates to rite in being one specific definition, centred on a recurrent set of these attributes. And then fifth, we have relational position within a burial sequence, i.e. in relation to previous burials. And sixthly, position in relation to a defined funerary or sanctified zone. And we can include here whether the physical structure of the site was modified in conjunction with this particular deposit. Now, these last two define relational position in general. Have we got a bit behind? Yes. And collectively, these 6 dimensions allow the definition of traditions of burial practice. Now, accepting this nomenclature is certainly not intended to imply that definable traditions are neatly bounded. On the interpretive side of the equation, we can see that the last... I beg your pardon. I have jumped ahead here. So we're now there. On the interpretive side of the equation, we can see that the last 2 in particular might bear on how the newly interred relates to those that went before, whereas all 6 could hypothetically contribute to the empirical classification of that individual. But this classification of the interred is one of the central questions under debate, and how we view that will have a major bearing on what we think was the purpose of this funerary phenomenon. That question is my main preoccupation in this series. In very broad outline, the millennium-long funerary phenomenon of my lectures can be broken down into 3 main stages, distinguishable from one another in various ways. Phase 1 involves what we might call pioneer beaker burial, about 2450 to 2300 BC, in which we find dug graves, sometimes with a small funerary enclosure, but no conclusive evidence for mound building. Burials are not numerous, and only rarely are they by cremation. Some are in close juxtaposition to earlier ones. My example here is from Chilbolton, with a secondary burial directly on top of the primary. So perhaps already a sense of expressing affinity through spatial proximity. Already too, grave goods range from more everyday objects to the valuables of the time. Phase 2 we can call climax beaker burial. It runs from about 2300 to 1950 BC, and it sees burials become much more common, much more numerous, and still very predominantly by inhumation, although cremation is beginning to become significant towards its end. There is now unambiguous evidence for covering mounds, which become frequent. The phase also features sudden expansion in the diversity of grave assemblages. Not only were there more varied forms of beaker put into the graves, but a novel pottery form, the food vessel, was added around the beginning of period 2. There were also new distinctive high-profile burial modes with weapons, garten slack for example, or with ornaments. Nevertheless, the majority have little more than a pot or basic tool, and many have no accompaniment at all. Sequences of burial are often in close spatial relationship within an individual mound or ring enclosure. Phase 3 is the mature burial tradition, about 1950 to 1500 BC. Cremation now has become the predominant burial rite, and a good proportion of cremations were placed in urns. Inhumations are, though, still noteworthy in many regions and can continue throughout this phase. There is increased investment in mound building, either through enlargement of existing mounds or the agglomeration of mounds in proximity to one another. Locally, this can result in barrow cairn cemeteries and occasionally to intense concentrations. I'll show you one or two as we proceed in the lecture series, not tonight necessarily. Grave groups continue to be varied, but there are certain recurrent themes and undoubtedly still many wholly unaccompanied burials. In order to properly conclude the sequence, I should also mention the later legacy, about 1500 to 800 BC. After the end of the early Bronze Age, burial became a less ostentatious and less labour-intensive practice, although we should not underestimate the cost of fuel for successful cremation, which remained the predominant rite. New mounds are now rare and their scale small. Burials are instead inserted into pre-existing ones or placed in apparently flat sites. They typically cluster in cremation cemeteries, but can be more isolated. Grave goods other than a pot, usually the container, are extremely rare, and many burials are totally unaccompanied, yet again. Now that was a highly simplified, potted history of the funerary phenomenon, and it is perhaps necessary to go into a bit more detail regarding the inception of the whole sequence, since this has given rise to quite conflicting viewpoints. The classic image of a burial at the beginning of our funerary phenomenon has been portrayed many a time. One cannot capture it better than in this early depiction of the burial at Roundway 8, first published by Davison and Furnham. A complete, articulated skeleton lies crouched on its side, accompanied by grave goods. It epitomises the discrete burial of an individual in what has come to be known as the single grave rite. At one time, this was seen to mark a sudden change from the Neolithic tradition of collective burial in long barrows and chambered tombs. But it has been known now for some decades that these two traditions are separated by a gulf of several centuries, and any comparisons between them can be as useful only as any other cross-cultural comparison. So the fact that Fred Peterson and subsequent researchers have demonstrated that early Bronze Age burials too can involve disarticulated remains, and the remains of more than one person, seen par excellence here at Boscombe Down, does not in itself help sustain an argument for continuity. It is essential anyway to consider the respective formation processes at work, rather than just the aggregate effect. The complex skeletal assemblages of the Neolithic are generally seen to be the aggregations over time of a sequence of deposits and reworkings in a stone or timber structure or a defined mortuary zone. By contrast, such assemblages where they occur in early Metal Age contexts are more usually single deposits which can combine anachronistic elements. The inclusion of ancestral relics can result from either the retention of human skeletal elements in circulation or their exhumation from previous burial deposits. We'll look at such processes in a little more detail presently. Either has implications for early Metal Age ritual concerns, but they do not necessarily equate with the specific practices of manipulation in the earlier Neolithic, not least because manipulation of human remains in one way or another now seems to have been endemic through British later prehistory. The other strand in the complex debate about continuity or intrusion stems from Ian Kinnis's work demonstrating that single grave burials with grave goods, sometimes fine goods, were of clear Neolithic date and indigenous tradition. Radiocarbon dating of a few, Lislow included, has since shown them to belong to the late 4th millennium and the turn to the 3rd. But even though these take us later than the cessation of classic long mound burial, they still stop roughly half a millennium earlier than the first beaker burials. So what do we know of burial in the intervening centuries, which basically comprise the late Neolithic? Until recently, in fact, very little. It had been suspected for some while that cremation was the normal rite, though not commonly exercised or not commonly in tangible contexts. They are best documented on certain religious sites, mainly henges or hengiforms, as at Cairnpapel, Stonehenge, Llandagai, Dorchester-on-Thames, and perhaps in a different context spread in the capping of the inner mound at Duggleby Howe. It itself, of course, enclosed by a massive circular earthwork. We now have some absolute dates for 3 Stonehenge cremated individuals, confirming an earlier 3rd millennium chronology, thanks to Mike Parker Pearson's Riverside project. And there is also the evidence of occasional associations with distinctive artefacts, notably cushion mace heads, transverse arrowheads, and bone skewer pins. But a quite separate strand of burial practice is now emerging for this same period, thanks to the dating of mainly unaccompanied skeletons. These have recently been collated by Francis Healy. Now, the examples most reliably dated to the late Neolithic, after 2900 BC, are not numerous, but all are unaccompanied burials, either crouched, as at flagstones, or disarticulated, as at Radley Barrow Hills. Now, while some are at established monuments, as at the formative henge at Flagstones, this may not be invariable. But one striking feature of the group, which Francis draws attention to, is the dominance of infants, children and adolescents. Only 2 or 3 so far are adults. The existence of crouched inhumations either side of the late Neolithic Chalcolithic transition does mean that we have to take seriously the possibility of a degree of continuity and the enrichment of an indigenous tradition. The addition of, in Alex Gibson's phrase, the beaker veneer. But crouched inhumation is such a common rite worldwide as to be of limited value as a diagnostic trait. Burial traditions are composite affairs with many variables, some tangible to us archaeologically, as discussed earlier, others less so. To accept the beaker artefact package as having been simply a veneer applied to pre-existing burial modes is, I think, to read the role of the artefacts too passively. We need to remember that point about the integrity of the context, the artefacts as integral components of the particular persona, and the body in turn as a central artefact. Thinking in these terms makes an important distinction between the inhumation burials of the late Neolithic and those of earliest beaker date, a distinction possibly reinforced by the difference in age structure, with that emphasis on very young people in the late Neolithic buried group. Furthermore, the inception beaker tradition can be paralleled in all its constituent elements in beaker funerary contexts on the opposite shores of the Channel and North Sea. This in itself does not definitively exclude the conversion of insular culture to an external idea, the adoption of the beaker ideological package as once held sway in interpretation. But of course, we now have increasing isotopic evidence that some people were highly mobile at this early Chalcolithic horizon. It is hard to escape the conclusion that the initial beaker funerary tradition was not only alien in concept, but was also accompanied by an intrusive set of people. In drawing this conclusion, I'm not saying that all the individuals buried in this pioneering beaker phase were incomers to Britain. It only takes a generation for there to be locally born descendants of beaker incomers who stayed. It is also clear that by the middle of the Chalcolithic, that's period 1, there were already significant modifications of burial practices along insular lines, and some of these were due to the impact of indigenous culture on the initially intrusive tradition. As the Genesis burial tradition gained momentum in the late third millennium, many burials came to be clustered together, and this gives rise to a raft of interesting questions about spatial and temporal interrelationships. I cannot give this the treatment it deserves tonight, but we'll try and cover it further in publication. Various workers have explored ideas about the meaning of close juxtaposition of successive burials by looking, for example, at such factors of whether orientations were maintained or reversed. By degrees, then, what started as the site of a single burial usually became a cemetery. Barnack is a fine example. Here it is obvious that a high frequency of burial in a confined space can lead to many and various kinds of juxtaposition, some of them doubtless accidental. But there are many cases where it is hard to reject the notion that the direct overlaying of an earlier burial was conscious and deliberate, as for example here at Gravelly Guy. And in an extreme version of this kind of superimposition, the new intrusion can disturb or even wholly rework the former burial. This desire for proximity may also be seen in another manifestation already mentioned, that of incorporating supplementary human remains with the newly deceased. This is often treated discreetly, but it could just be a difference of form, the earlier skeletal parts being brought to the new burial context rather than vice versa. The key difference in form is that if the new bones must join the old, then the spot for burial is instantly predefined, whereas if the old bones may be brought to the new, then there is freedom to choose a new location for burial. Yet another possible variant on proximity arises from contemporary deposits set within a defined space. In this situation, it is time that is close rather than precise location, and sometimes contemporaneity might be contrived by delaying the interment of some bodies, as Harding and Healy have recently suggested. Exact contemporaneity of interment is difficult to demonstrate unequivocally from archaeological evidence, but circumstantial evidence can sometimes suggest that two or more burials were simultaneous. My example here in the lake group, Barrow 36F, where there is a symmetry in the opposition between sexes and sidedness and orientation, as well as symmetry of position around the centre of the barrow. Possibly difficult decisions had to be made as to whether to insert into a pre-existing mound or sacred zone, how to relate the new grave to past ones, or whether to build anew, and if so, how near or how far away. Each of these decisions may have had its own implications, not just relating to the newly deceased, but for future burial in the complex. Even if the pattern of future burials could not be anticipated, the addition of each new defined zone gave a new potential focus, resulting in the need for some understanding of respective roles in relation to other foci. We may ask questions such as, did each new site as it emerged, did it become the principal site, each in turn? Or did the steady multiplication of mounds result from bifurcation, with ever finer divisions of society having assigned their own monument? Overall, we can see an underpinning drive towards the agglomeration of burials, sometimes also expressed in the agglomeration of monuments. In either case, the creation of cemeteries, as we have termed them. Now collectively, these sites all over the country must have originally contained a very large number of burials, and this can lead to the impression that they are whole population cemeteries of the sort familiar to us in recent history. But this has actually been repeatedly questioned since Richard Atkinson's seminal paper on the matter in 1972. And we must briefly turn our attention to this question because it has a potentially massive effect on interpretation. I'm not going to bamboozle you with the detail of my own attempts at the numbers game. Obviously, estimation of the original number of burials, and even more so that of the population of the time, is fraught with problems and steeped in assumptions. We can only expect to achieve the crudest of estimates in terms of orders of magnitude. I've actually tried to err on the cautious side, that is, not to load my assumed values towards an imbalance between the buried population and the living population. Nevertheless, I cannot get closer than a ratio of about 1 to 18. This is based on roughly 29,000 surviving or recorded round barrows or cairn sites. That includes all recognised ring ditches, and the assumption that almost as many again may have been destroyed without trace. And I have allowed a fairly generous average of 10 burials per monument. I think Richard Atkinson allowed about 3. These represent 700 years of the building and systematic use of such monuments. These figures would imply a living population of just 20,000 if all were buried formally, whereas using a rather low figure of 3 people per occupied kilometre square, and I've excluded large tracts of Britain as unoccupied, this figure I've taken from ethnographic examples of pastoralist communities simply because it is low. I thereby estimate a population in the order of 360,000. So the upshot of all this is that using a series of rather cautious estimates, we still only seem to have one recognisable burial for every 18 of the population. Obviously, locally, where barrow and burial intensification took place, this ratio could change dramatically, but only if we assume that by and large only the local community were buried in such complexes, whereas in fact it is frequently suggested that intensification is instead based on an enlarged population catchment. Having established that critical if very approximate ratio, which will play an important part in my later arguments, I need finally to turn attention to the main ways in which burials have been interpreted in the past. A simple distillation is as follows. Interpretation 1. The burial rite is primarily seen to be about the deceased's journey to another world, ensuring they are appropriately disposed and provisioned for the journey. Ideas on appropriate disposition and provisioning will of course be as varied as cosmologies themselves, but it may be assumed that certain normative views prevailed in a given culture. My sometimes speculative suggestions in the boxes surrounding this and the next two diagrams are there merely as aids to visualization, to, if you like, bring to life the concept in question. Don't take them too seriously. Interpretation 2. In this, the burial mode is still seen as being focused on the deceased individual, but of more concern is that the appearance of the deceased properly conveys his or her position in life. And there is, of course, implicit assumption that this could be carried forward into the next world. So particular objects or treatments of the body would be understood to stand for particular positions or occupations in life. And thirdly, the burial rite now reflects the concerns of survivors, the mourners, their needs to deal with the personal emotions of loss and any political consequences of the death, as well as to commemorate fittingly the completed earthly life. I shall refer to this under the umbrella title of Mourner's Choice. Now, though these three have been set up, particularly the last two, have been set up in opposition to some extent in recent writings, in reality, of course, these three are not exclusive of one another. Two or all three raison d'etres can interact to contribute to the decisions made. Mourner's Choice has become an influential explanation over the past 2 decades. At its core is the more explicit acknowledgement that funerary rites may not be predefined according to the status of the deceased. Various authors, going back to John Barrett, have discussed the role of the mourners in constructing the particular funerary behaviour associated with an individual burial. Particular emphasis in these discussions has been given to the effects on the grave goods. Previous assumptions that grave goods are strictly tied to the individual's position in life thus have been questioned, and at the same time the active role of the living in the funeral process has been brought to the fore. These bring welcome sophistication to our considerations of how communities in the early Metal Age arrived at a particular way of presenting their dead to the other world. Although these new approaches have questioned the assumption that all objects found alongside the deceased were personal possessions, they nevertheless almost invariably still relate objects in some respect to the individual's character, role, or personal history. Objects introduced to the grave may therefore be metaphors for certain societal relationships. They may represent important past connections, for example, place of origin, or may state claims on behalf of certain mourners seeking some kind of advantage or link. The overall effect of Mourner's Choice is to introduce, of course, further complexity into interpreting the grave assemblage. Each individual component may have its own raison d'etre for inclusion, and consequently the various components may not link together as an identifiable set. In fact, in general, the focus of Mourner's Choice hypothesis has been on exceptional or infrequent elements of funerary contexts. Such can readily be explained by capricious, individualistic choices on the part of mourners. It may be a valid point, for example, to say that the 3 copper rings buried in the grave of infants at Radley Barrows Hills were unlikely to have been worn by the 4 to 5-year-old child in question. Joe Brooke instead sees their placement in the grave as an attempt by the relatives to proclaim an intended status for their dead infant or infants, a not implausible scenario. But for as long as that particular association remains a unique circumstance, and it does, it contributes relatively little to our understanding of any broadly observed rules of burial at this time. More telling in this context is the presence of two beaker vessels, for it is these that unite this burial with contemporary early Chalcolithic graves elsewhere, despite the unusualness of other aspects of the grave. One of the dangers of overemphasizing the mourner's choice hypothesis then is that it encourages unique interpretations of individual contexts at the expense of understanding commonalities across multiple contexts. Single context interpretations are no less valid, but they do answer to a different plane of inquiry, and are by definition more speculative because they do not have the support of any repetitious pattern in the wider data set. These two modes of interpretation are therefore essentially complementary, the one rather anecdotal with reference to the individual, the other more generic and referring to the scheme of things in the eyes of broader communities. Both play their part in reconstructing social history, but my lecture series will focus very much on trying to get a better handle on the scheme of things. This is not a question of seeking to homogenise the data, not least there is ample scope for the meaning of any archaeologically recognised mode to have mutated through time and across space. But I still think it is impossible to refute that specific modes of representation of death existed and that these formed a backbone of structuration in the complex funerary rituals of the early Metal Age. It is explicit in recent writings about our burial phenomenon that the burial serves as a medium for communication to all onlookers. In addition to the self-reinforcing of corrective messages supplied to the involved community, there is also the potential for giving signals to other social groups who may have played no part in the formulation of the particular burial, but might still have an interest in the conduct of the funeral and its implications. This, of course, relates to the status indicator interpretation of assemblages and the idea that ostentatious burial can be exploited in cycles of competitive consumption. However, there is another important communicative aspect that's been neglected: the messages the bereaved community might be trying to send to the ancestors and spirit world through their choice of burial rite in the context of the given death. Ostentatious burial, or indeed formal burial of any kind, can be construed as a kind of presentation to the otherworld. It is a presentation that naturally had to accord with certain understood rules if it was not to antagonise the ancestors and spirits. But it was still necessary for the community to make a decision on how to present the given deceased in the light, I would suggest, of three factors. Firstly, obviously, the social position of the individual. Secondly, the politics of the moment. And thirdly, the community's past history of engagement with the other world. The role of social position is self-evident, but it may not result in universal treatment for all of comparable standing when the other two factors come into play. We'll pick up again on this later. This is a crucial point to appreciate, and as I say, I come back to it in later lectures. One of the problems that bedeviled study of this funerary phenomenon through much of the later 20th century was the question of how much confidence could we place in the sexing of burials found by the early barrow diggers. It is undoubtedly the case that sex was sometimes attributed by antiquarians on the basis of assumed gender roles of the artefacts present. If a grave had ornaments and an awl, for example, it must be that of a female. This situation led to a split among archaeologists, as to whether legitimate conclusions could be drawn on funerary rolls, or whether we should just hold back, abstain from interpretation. Now, fortunately, the steady accumulation of new data has changed all this, and while it transpires that the sex of the buried individual is not always predictable from the grave goods, we can now affirm with confidence that there were some general rules of association that were only occasionally broken. This renewed confidence in the sexing of many burials enables me to structure 3 of my core lectures, those you will hear tomorrow, around categories of artefacts that are tied for the most part to one or the other sex. So we will be looking at these iconic objects, used often in demonstrative, contradistinctive ways. Daggers of metal and flint, and finely crafted stone sceptres, all of which predominantly furnished male graves. You can see those top left and into the middle. Halberds and axe hammers, top right of slide, which were kept absolutely discreet from the grave, but which may have served comparable roles among different social groups. And then the superbly crafted and originally designed ornament repertoire, complex strings of exotic beads, beautifully embossed sheet metal, and so on, material which from the beginning of period 2 was largely associated with females. In the last of my core lectures, lecture 5, I'll take a rather different tack by considering the main metalwork type that for some reason only very rarely occurs in funerary contexts. This is, of course, the axe head. A classic hoard here from Dunsapig Crag, not far from where we're sitting. Axe heads went through a continuous sequence of changing style with ever more elaboration of applied decoration. We will see that its symbolic role to these early Metal Age societies was quite profound. But I want to inquire again into why these were kept separate from the funerary preoccupation of the time. And then, in the final lecture, I'll develop the concept of the presentation of the dead. Thank you.